my morbid friends. This is Madame Morbid here. Today we're going to be talking about the Argonne offensive, featuring a diary kept by Lieutenant Lawrence Leroy O'Kelley. His family called him Roy. He was born in Mount Vernon, Missouri. His parents were Charles O'Kelley and Nellie Bearden. During his childhood, they did relocate to Ash Grove, Missouri. His diary is probably the most descriptive diary I have ever read. It is so well written. I'm not sharing the whole thing. I am only sharing the portion in which he describes the Battle of the Meuse Argonne. He was wounded the second day. The entry you're going to hear was written September 25th, the night before, and then it jumps to October 10th, in which he goes back and describes everything that happened to him. He names people, and when possible, I have identified these people. The one that hit me the hardest, I think, was probably the 17 or 18-year-old runner that he describes the death of. His name was William Harry Hall. He was mistakenly recorded in the newspaper as having survived the battle, so his poor parents at first heard that news of his death was a mistake and that he was only gassed, only to find out later that he had in fact perished in the battle. He mentions Samuel Clark. He says Samuel Clark stopped several machine gun bullets here, which initially makes it sound like he died. However, he was severely wounded. He did survive. However, like a lot of veterans of World War I, he did not live a long life. They had a lot of problems from being exposed to gas, to the mental effects of what they went to lingering effects of long-term physical maiming. So he did pass away in 1930. Once they arrive in France, he talks in detail about every town they went to, how long they stayed. Then they moved to the next place. He told you what towns they went through to get to the next town, until they finally, when I am going to start reading, get to September 25th, in which they have gone to the Argonne. At the time of this battle, Roy O'Kelley was 24 years old. His job as a lieutenant would have included things like censoring the mail of his men. So every letter a man in his company wrote, he had to read and make sure they did not include information sensitive to the war effort. So pretty much everything contained in his diary. An enlisted man would not have been allowed to keep this diary, and frankly, Roy probably wouldn't have been allowed to keep this either, because had it fallen into German hands, it records every single movement the Army made. Leroy O'Kelley was in the 35th Infantry Division, which was made up of 2 National Guard units, headquartered out of Fort Leavenworth. Their most famous member was 33rd President Harry S. Truman, who commanded an artillery unit during the war. He was also at the Argonne and probably took part in that massive bombardment that O'Kelley mentions. By the way, that bombardment cost $180 million, which came out to about $1 million a minute. He was right. It literally was the largest bombardment in the 4 years of the war. They actually used more artillery than the entire 4 years of the Civil War. But the 35th trained at Camp Donovan in Oklahoma, and then they went to Camp Mills, New York, and they arrived in France May 11th, 1918. Most of their time was spent out of action. It was 92 days in quiet sectors versus 5 in active zones. So obviously those 5 days were pretty serious. The 35th took tremendous casualties during the Argonne. It actually had to be relieved early due to serious losses. O'Kelley talks about the tremendous fog. So the 137th and the 139th actually got really intermingled in that first push due to the fog because nobody could see anything. He said he had to navigate using his compass. So they could not tell where they were or even if they were going straight ahead or, so it was just chaos. A little history about the Vauquois strong point. The French and the Germans had been fighting over this hill since 1914. At one point, there was a small village at the top where about 170 people lived. And in 1914, the Germans came, they evacuated the town, and they started to fortify that area. It was very important because it had a tremendous view of the whole area around, and this is the Verdun area, and so obviously a lot of you know that Verdun was just a massive campaign. And so much of the fighting around that area, they just didn't go anywhere. They were going by inches and feet, only to be pushed back again. And so the French took this spot very briefly and lost it within the next day. The area turned into, it was not your typical trench warfare area. It actually was an underground war. They had tunnels. The French had tunnels. The Germans had tunnels. They were built very well. They had, in some ways, all the comforts of home. Mess hall, although small in comparison to what you would envision a mess hall to be, but it had storerooms and many dugouts that served as bedrooms. There's a bed still down there, a bed frame, a wooden table where they would have had dinner. So they tried to get at each other by blowing each other up with underground mines. I share a Google image of the area today where you still see the massive craters from satellite imagery from where they were blowing each other up. There are up to 8,000 people buried in that area who were never found. They're unknown. They died in these explosions and they stayed where they were. So this hill that at one time was 290 meters tall is in current day basically split in half. It was like this when the 139th took it. It had already been fought over like this. It had already been just mined to death. And luckily that day it was only lightly defended. They took the hill rather easily. I think there were only 100 to 150 Germans living in those tunnels, and when they saw the Americans coming, they retreated pretty easily or surrendered. As he says, they were taking so many prisoners. I'm not going to talk a whole lot of tactics about the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but basically what you need to know is it was the last major offensive of World War I. It was also the largest military operation that the United States had ever engaged in its history up to that point. Although, in terms of engagements that the French or the Germans and the other allies, Great Britain, had been involved in, it was somewhat smaller in comparison, but it was the biggest one that the Americans took part in, and it was the biggest historically for America. Well, the 35th was somewhat poorly prepared for this, and you kind of see this in the diary before that reads like a vacation journal. He talks about each town they go to and the sights he sees and the history and the architecture, and only occasionally he talks about, oh, we drill in the morning, and that's about it. And apparently their leadership was changed very shortly before the Argonne, which caused a lot of confusion. There were problems with communicating with one another. The regimental history talks about commanders sending off messages wanting instructions. What do I do? And not getting a response, and then having to make this decision. Well, then I'm just gonna make that call on my own and we're gonna attack. So they just weren't getting information. And part of that is the time period. They were relying on runners get killed, or they don't make it to where they're going to send that message. O'Kelley lost his runner that first day, and he talks about lieutenants being in command of brigades. Everyone was getting killed. All the leadership was getting killed. So it was not good, and ultimately the 35th had to be relieved after the day 5 because they were just so scattered and had lost so many men. A lot of them did reorganize and come back in later parts of the engagement, which ultimately lasted 47 days from September 26th to the end of the war on November 11th. So that is just a very brief background. I know I didn't get into a lot of detail. That's not really my intention, really. I just want you to have enough context to understand the diary entry. I personally don't think it needs any help from me. It's so fabulous, and he didn't like to talk about it the rest of his life. He wrote this journal, he put it in a trunk, and he forgot it ever even existed. Didn't ever want to look at it again, didn't tell his family anything about what he'd been through. It is just a fabulous journal, and I hope you guys really enjoy it. Moved again. On the 19th, our division marched to a small village a few kilometers from the woods and found about 30 miles of French auto trucks lined up waiting for us. It took several hours to get us all loaded and straightened out, and then we started about 3 p.m. We took a northwest course through Toul and Bar-le-Duc to the great forest of Argonne, about 20 kilometers southwest of Verdun, which has the bloodiest record of any city in history. All of our men know that in very few days they will take the great chance, and that some of them are fated to make the supreme sacrifice. But they all seem to be in good spirits, and even joke about their chances of returning. All of we officers are frantically studying and marking our new battle maps. Get everything in shape for the great battle. There are thousands of things to do, inspecting equipment, issuing ammunition and grenades, and giving our men their final warnings and instructions. I believe I'm becoming web-footed. I sleep out in the rain every night and wade through the mud all day. I haven't had my boots off for 10 days now, so we'll probably be able to keep them on for another 10 days. Tomorrow night, we march to the front line, take our position in front of Vauquois strongpoint, await the end of the preliminary barrage, and then, over the top. I've written a letter to everyone I know because I'm not sure that my correspondence won't be interrupted for a while. October 10th, 1918. Well, I was lucky. Through the battle and still able to write. From 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. September 26th, my battalion lay on the ground, listening to and waiting for the termination of the most terrific artillery bombardment known in the 4 years of war. At 6 a.m., the artillery fire ceased as suddenly as it had begun, and we started over in successive waves of squad columns. It was so foggy I couldn't see more than 20 feet on each side, so had to march by compass. The fog proved to be a blessing. We stormed Vauquois strongpoint with a very few casualties. My friend Lieutenant MacDonald dropped dead with 3 machine gun bullets in the face, the first 5 minutes over. In 1916, the French captured this fort with a loss of 200 men, but lost it again the following day. I never saw so much barbed wire in all my life. One belt after another of wire from 50 to 100 feet in width, and concealed contact mines everywhere. A misstep would blow up the whole company. The first morning, we lost but a few men by artillery fire, but in the afternoon it was very intense, and machine bullets whistling and thudding in the ground all around. The artillery was especially bad at one time, when we came into plain view on top of a bald knob. One of my runners, a tow-headed, rosy-cheeked boy by the name of Hall, was killed by a shell while standing right beside me. The explosion broke his bayonet and drove pieces of it clear through him, while it only knocked me over. I lost several men at this place. Advancing up the Booth River, we surprised and captured a lot of German soldiers and officers. They were sure a frightened-looking bunch, afraid we would bayonet them. My force had lost very lightly, but I didn't kill these Germans, as I could spare some men to take them back. The ground we were fighting over was surely a desolate-looking waste. The great forest of Argonne, so green and luxurious the day before, was now nothing but a great stretch of blackened, blasted stumps. Everywhere were dead Germans, Americans, horses, fallen airplanes, wrecked tanks, steel helmets, rifles, bayonets, grenades, and unexploded shells. As soon as it got dark, we stopped on the reverse slope of a hill, established liaison with the elements on each side, and dug in. I picked a fine big shell hole for my bedroom that had only a few inches of water in it. Water didn't make any difference because it rained all night anyway. At daybreak the next morning, we started out again and ran into a perfect hail of machine gun bullets and shrapnel. Major Stepp of the 3rd Battalion, a 32-degree Masonic friend, was killed here. My own major, Major Clark, stopped a few machine gun bullets, so my captain had to take charge of the battalion. Lieutenants Brown, Kirk, and Cosgrove were killed about the same time. The poison gas was very bad. But we had our mass ready and suffered but little loss. Sergeant Mitchell was gassed here. Sergeants Davis and Whitten fell with machine gun bullets, and Big Sergeant McLaughlin was blown to shreds by a shell. But at the same time, it was comforting to see the thousands of German prisoners winding back in long columns. Heading toward the raised village of Mont Blainville, we ran into direct artillery fire. This is terrible. You don't hear the shriek of the shell and don't know when to drop. Coming to the edge of a hill, Sergeant Coates and my orderly ran ahead of the company with me to see if the ground ahead was cleared of the enemy before bringing up the men. This side of the hill was very steep, and we looked right down on the roofs of a couple German billets and a lot of dugouts. I saw but one German running through the underbrush and dropped him with my automatic. I never did reach him where he lay, so have the satisfaction of not knowing if I killed him. While standing on the top of this hill, we were sighted by the German artillery and dropped just in time to avoid a shell which came over us and burst about 30 feet back of us. We saw we'd have to get out of view, so Sergeant Coates and I hooked our arms and tumbled over the edge of the hill. Just as we reached the bottom, I heard the shriek of a shell, an ear-splitting report and flash of fire. I woke up the next day in a hospital about 20 miles behind the lines. I learned later that Sergeant Coates had had his head blown off. Also, that my men had discovered the crews of the German machine guns hidden in our billets and had killed them with bayonets. When I recovered consciousness on the 28th, I discovered that I had been mussed up considerably. On my way back, I had been relieved of my pistol, dagger, field glasses, uniform, and all other worldly effects. When I arrived at the hospital, I was costumed in my overseas cap and German blanket full of cooties. I found that I had a sufficient number of arms and legs, but 3 of my slats had been caved in. I'd stopped a few little fragments of shrapnel, and I couldn't talk, walk, hear, or even eat. I could see but little of the glory and war in the hospital when I lay there watching the hundreds of broken, shattered men suffering and dying all around me. I remained in this hospital at Verdun until October 1st, when I was put on a hospital train and sent to Base Hospital 49 at Allerly, near Chalon-sur-Seine in Dijon. I have been here 10 days now, and am able to walk around with the aid of a couple of canes. The hospital at Verdun was bombed by German aviators 1 day after I left. I've developed a great respect for these American Red Cross nurses. They are real soldiers. This concludes my reading of the account of Lawrence Leroy O'Kelley. There is one entry after this one. Feeling better. He's been in the hospital 15 days or so, and so he goes to Nice to continue to convalesce, sees the sights, and talks about the architecture and the history of the area. He pretty much did that for every place he ever visited during his time in France. He does not talk about his journey home, coming back to his family. He does not react to the end of the war in November. So sadly, we don't get that perspective. I guess for him the war was over the second he got into the hospital, so it didn't really make that big of a impact, or he was just tired of talking about it. He returned home to Colorado. He married Inez Dolores Hazen. They had 2 children. He worked in the lumber industry, spent several years living in Denver. Eventually, in 1948, he moved to Washington State. He passed away in 1968 at the age of 74. He's buried in the National Cemetery in Seattle. Just a note about sources and images. I want to thank the State Historical Society of Missouri, who have possession of the diary. It is full text online, so I am sharing the link to the full text of this journal below. I want to thank the O'Kelley family for donating the journal. I also want to thank Mike O'Kelley for sending me photographs to use during this presentation. When possible, any image I had to find on the internet, I tried to make sure it was at least of the Argonne, but not all necessarily are. For example, the one of the soldier in the shell hole, that's probably not the Argonne. However, it is indicative of the basic experience of soldiers at that time. I hope everyone has enjoyed this presentation, and I will catch you next time.